In a previous video, I went over how to download and install xcp-ng, which is a free open source hypervisor based on Citrix hypervisor. Now, although it gives you a link to easily download and install an actual virtual machine that's got Xen Orchestra on it, which is the management software used to manage these hypervisors, the trouble is it's kind of limited in terms of what you can do. There is a free version that you've got there, and it can do certain things. But one thing it certainly can't do is to apply patches to the actual hypervisors. It'll tell you that there's patches available to upgrade the actual hypervisors, but you can't do it. If you want to, you can take out a trial license, and then you'll get access to all of the features for a short period of time. Or you can pay for a subscription, for example. The more that you pay, the more features you get access to, and you also get more technical support. But Xen Orchestra itself is actually open source as well, and thankfully there's a developer out there who's made it a lot easier to actually compile your own version of Xen Orchestra so that you'll get access to all these features. And if that's something you're interested in learning, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. So this is the actual version of Xen Orchestra that I've got deployed to manage my test copy of xcp-ng. And when I say test, it literally is just for testing purposes, because xcp-ng itself is actually a virtual machine running within ESXi. So I've got an ESXi hypervisor which is running on the actual physical hardware. xcp-ng is being installed as a virtual machine, and so I've actually got this XOA, which is a virtual machine within a virtual machine within a hypervisor. So I do take a bit of a performance hit here, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter, because I can still do everything I particularly want to do, except for this particular version of XOA in the sense that it's very limited. I mean, I can still build virtual machines, but there's quite a lot of features in here that I don't get access to. For one thing, it's not even registered, and it's also a case of you need to take out subscription licenses, like I was mentioning in the actual intro. So for example, we're on the dashboard here. If I go over to the visualizations tab, you can see it's saying we need to be able to have a premium edition to be able to get access to this information. If we go to statistics, it's saying you need the enterprise edition to be able to get that information. Now, one thing I do like about this is that if we go right up over here, right at the top level, it's actually warning us about some problems further downstream. So I do like how it's doing that. But if we go over to here, you can see that warning's popping up in pools. So I go over to there, and we're in the actual pool. I mean, mine's actually named after the hypervisor itself. That's how it starts, but you can always change it afterwards. Now, you can see it's got this 34 over there, and if I hover over it, it's saying it's missing. We've got 34 missing patches. So if I click on that, it takes us over to here. We can then click on the patches tab. It's saying that, well, you need the starter edition to be able to apply these patches. So there's patches out there, you just can't install them unless you've got at least the starter edition. So we go and click on the upgrade now button, and this takes us to basically the pricing page on the website. So it's saying there's a free version which has got the basic features. If you scroll down, it'll tell you more about, you can click on that option to see the full product matrix. It gives you a breakdown of all the individual features you get. So yeah, it is available for free, but if you want to be able to apply patches, for example, you need to pay for a starter edition at the very least. And that's $77 per month. It does get you access to technical support, for example, and various other things, but there are other features, and it's all tiered. All the pricing, the more you pay, the more technical support you get, for example, and the more features you get, and so on. So it's a case of, if you're an actual business, then it makes sense that, chances are you'll probably be paying, for one of these subscriptions, probably for the actual technical support alone more than anything. But for someone like me, I'm quite happy to do without that. I mean, it's a case of, I could do with an actual fully working hypervisor and management software suite, and I can't actually get that because XOA itself, Xen Orchestra, it is available in open source. The problem is you've actually got to create your own copy of it. Essentially, you've got to build that from source. Now, fortunately, there is a developer out there who's made it a lot easier by making it available as a script, for example, and they've actually done it in different ways. If I go over to their Github website over here, I'll just go back to the main page. He's got two different setups here, one where you can use it as a Docker container, and then you've got the normal one over here. The option basically is, if you go down this path, you'll need to create your own virtual machine, and then you've actually got two choices. You can actually run a script to actually download the source code, and it'll compile it, and it'll create you that image of Xen Orchestra, or you can download that completed image anyway, because Roni here, he's actually, what he did from what I've read in his GitHub documentation here, is he started off and he made this himself. He's just made it available to ourselves for free, which is absolutely great. But it's relatively straightforward to do, but before we actually go anywhere, we actually need a virtual machine to begin with, because no matter which of those two options, I mean, this is the path that I'm taking. I'm not going to go down Docker containers, although it is an option. No matter which of those two options I go, whether it's going to be compiling it myself or just downloading a pre-built image, I still need to have a virtual machine running a version of Linux that I can use to then run Xen Orchestra, because it's just an application at the end of the day. So that's the first thing I need to do, is build a virtual machine. So we've got this Xen Orchestra, which at least allows us to create the virtual machine. And the idea is we'll create our own copy of XOA to replace this one. So we'll have this version, and then we'll put it to one side once we've got our own fully working version. So first thing we need to do is create the actual virtual machine. Now the actual specs required for the virtual machine aren't that particularly big. If we go over to XOA, it's showing you what the actual specs you should be using for a virtual machine. So it's saying you need 2 CPUs, 2 gig of RAM, 20 gig of space at a minimum. That's the minimum spec. But it's also saying, like, by all means, add more memory. If you've got a lot more virtual machines to be managing, then put more memory into this. Now, what I will say is I'm actually running it on those specs on an Intel NUC, because I'm not running hardly any virtual machines at all, and it works perfectly fine on those. The only thing to bear in mind is what we're doing is to actually compile actual software to create an image. So it makes kind of sense really to give it a bit more processing power, at least to begin with, and then we can always scale it down afterwards. So I'm going to go over to Home, then we're going to select VMs, then we're going to click on New VM. Now, the way this all is set up is it's based on the idea it's a complete enterprise solution, basically. So the expectation would be you'd have a lot of hypervisors, and they're going to be in pools for redundancy. So in our case, even right out of the box, we've got a pool at least to begin with. Mine just happens to be named after the hypervisor that I first created. So I'll just click on the pool, and what it's asking us for is what template do you want to use to actually create this VM. So I'll click on that drop down box. Now in my case, I'm going to go for Debian Buster 10. It's not the latest version, but it's the latest version known as far as templates go on this copy of xcp-ng. So I'll select that. I'm going to change its name. I'm going to call this one XOA-CE, but you can call it whatever you like. So that, for me, it just distinguishes between the version that we're running, which is just XOA, and this one, which is sort of like a community edition, if you will. Processors. I've got up to 8 processors allocated to the actual hypervisor virtual machine. I've used 2 of them up for this specific VM. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it 4 processors. What we'll do is we'll scale back afterwards. But I just want to give it a bit more processing power to see if it'll be able to take full advantage of more processors to speed the actual compilation up quicker. I'm going to give it a bit more extra memory to help as well. I'm not going to bother touching a topology. So that's to do with how the processors are presented to the actual virtual machine. I can leave that as is, but what I do need to do is tell it what image we're going to use to actually boot from. So I'm going to point it over to my Debian one. Now this is a shared ISO folder that I've got. I've covered this in previous videos on how to set these up, along with things like NFS shares for shared storage, but in our case that's the only actual ISO file I've got, so that's enough that I need, so that's fine. So I'll select that. So when this computer boots up, it'll boot off that ISO image, and it won't let me do anything else. Unlike, say, like VMware, for example, you can build a virtual machine with bits missing if you like. It's not that fussy, whereas xcp-ng is. I mean, you're either going to be pointing at an ISO image or a CD drive, or you've got to be setting it up with an expectation that it'll be able to get access to what it needs to over the network. So in our case, we do have access to the image, so we'll leave it set there. Now, this is just a test network. I'm not really going to be doing anything with these hypervisors other than testing probably things like patches, features, and that sort of stuff. So I'm quite happy to leave this in one network effectively. The hypervisor is accessed through one network card. So that's what I'm just going to allow this virtual machine to use. It's just the default network that it's got. In the real network that I've got, the hypervisors have got access to multiple virtual LANs or VLANs. The idea being that the virtual machines run in different networks, but I have a dedicated management network so that I can get management access of the virtual machine and the actual hypervisors. In this machine, it actually needs access to the hypervisors themselves. So whatever network you've got those hypervisors in, this needs access to them. So like I said, in my case, it's just a test lab, so I can leave that on its defaults. In the real world, I had to pick out the exact management interface that was in the management network for it. Now for the disks, this is an important virtual machine. This is a machine that's going to be used for actually managing the hypervisor, so I will want some proper redundancy. If I run this on one hypervisor and the hypervisor breaks, well, the virtual machine's no longer running. So if I install this on the hypervisor's local storage, the problem is, well, none of the other hypervisors have got access to it, at least not in this type of scenario anyway. So in which case we're more reliant on shared storage. So like I mentioned before, I have gone over another video where I've actually gone through the process of how to set up access to an NFS share, for example. So that's where we're going to be deploying this to an NFS share that this specific hypervisor is being connected to. So we'll select that. What it actually does, it creates a name. It gives you these random letterings after the actual name, so it goes by the template and then it just puts some random characters at the end. But I'm going to make this a bit easier for me to understand. So this is going to be my XOA underscore CE, for example. Quite happy to leave that set to that. For its description, I'm going to set the size as 20 gig as it mentions. But the idea is just so that I can recognize this if I need to at some later date. Advanced settings, I'm going to leave those alone for now. I mean, the default is it's as soon as we've finished creating it, it's actually going to boot the virtual machine up. It does have an option of auto power on, which is extremely important actually for a virtual machine like this, because this is a machine that, you know, if you're powering up your hypervisors from scratch, you would want a virtual machine like this to power up. It's a lot easier than having to then connect into the hypervisor, finding out what hypervisor it's actually running on, and then manually starting the virtual machine. This is like a whole automated process you want one running all the time. So it would make sense to tick that box. Now, in this case, I've already got a copy of Xen Orchestra running. So what I want to do is basically get this new version up and running. We'll then retire the version we're running now, and then we'll configure this virtual machine to always power up. And that's pretty much it as far as things go. There are other things you can change, you know, in terms of like affinity, for example, but I'm quite happy to leave things as they are. Now, you get a bit of a summary down there, but really it's a case of clicking on create. It'll create the virtual machine, it'll boot it up, and then I'll have to go through the process of actually installing actual Debian. Now, there's no point in me going through that because this video is more about Xen Orchestra than anything else. So I'll get this virtual machine created, and then once that's ready, I'll bring you back to show you how to actually install Xen Orchestra. Well, I've now got Debian installed on this virtual machine. Disconnected the disk. I've also went through the actual installation process, and I opted not to actually install the desktop environment because I don't really need it. The idea is this is just a VM. It's going to be running the Xen Orchestra application, so we'll be actually logging into the application, so I don't particularly plan on coming back to here except to update Xen Orchestra maybe every now and again. So for that reason, I don't really need the desktop. I can do everything from the command line, so it makes the whole thing a lot more efficient. Now, one thing I did do as well is once this was all installed, is I set up a static IP address. So if we have a look at the file that I've changed, because right out of the box, it's actually running DHCP. It didn't give me an option to specify an IP address, so I went into this file, /etc/network/interfaces, referencing up there. I changed that from DHCP to static, and then I put in the actual IP addressing information. So in this case, I went and put in the address, and I put this in as a prefix as opposed to just the IP address, because then it saves me putting the net mask in as well. We do need the gateway. We also need to tell about the DNS server that we've got, because that's an internal DNS server which can do DNS resolution over the internet. The idea is this needs to be able to get access to various internet files, pull them down and so on. So for that reason I do need to make sure it can resolve FQDNs. Now, once this is all up and running, I actually need to switch over to root because we're doing software installation. Now I can't do like an elevated privilege for this account. I created an account as part of the installation process, but I need to actually do the installation as root. So sudo is not installed on the machine, so I'm just going to let me just switch user, and this will switch me over to the root user account. So one of the first things I need to do, just do a quick check just to make sure there's nothing that needs to be updated. Okay, so that's all up to date. So we then need to install a means to get access to the Git repository. So apt install git. I'll say yes to install that. And then once that's installed, we can then effectively clone the actual directory from that user. Because that's literally all it is. We're just copying down their directory, you know, each individual subfolder, each individual file within there. So now that I've installed that, I need to clone their actual directory. Now, the thing is, if I'd installed OpenSSH, I would have probably made my life easier because I could have SSH'd into the actual device and done copying and pasting, but I'm in the console, so I can't copy and paste anything, unfortunately. Essentially, what we're doing is we want to get this. That's what we want to reference. So I'll just go back again. So it's https:// github.com. One thing I've noticed is if you do make an error, you know, you mistype it or something somewhere, what it actually does, it actually prompts you for a user account. So that's one way you can tell you've probably just typed something wrong. So yeah, that's not going to work. So there you go, so that worked fine. So that's basically just copied that directory down to our local drive. So if I have a look here, we've now actually got a folder. It should be a duplicate of that one. So I'll switch over to that folder. And you can see what we've got in here is a file called sample.xo-install.config. That's the actual file we want to be calling it. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy that, and what I can do is I can just partly type the actual file name, hit the tab, and it'll auto complete it. So we need to create our own version, because that always gives us something to refer back to. So that'll be xo-install.config, and then I need to edit that file, but I also need to actually create some certificates for the actual web server, because by default, if we just go into that file, actually, you can see by default it's going to run on port 80, which means it's an unencrypted session. And because it's on port 80, it means it's not referencing any certificates to use. But there are no certificates at the moment, so we've actually got to create some first. So I need to go to the SSL folder. Need a space between there. I'm going to make a directory called XO and swap over to that folder. And then I'm going to use OpenSSL to actually create our actual files that we're going to be using for the server. So it's OpenSSL. We need a new key. We want to use RSA 4096 bits. It's an X509 certificate we need to request. We're going to use SHA-256. And it's up to you what you want to set the expiry as. So this is actually set to expire in 10 years, which is a long time away, but it's fine for the sake of a test lab. Further down the line, the plan would be to have a certificate authority that actually hands out proper certificates, but I don't have access to one of those at the minute. So in which case, we're just going to make do with private certificates. I need to call that one the certificate XOA.crt. It doesn't necessarily have to be called that. It just gives you something to reference it by, and that's going to be XO.key. So just double check I've typed that in properly. Like I say, it would be a lot easier if I'd installed OpenSSH as a server. So if it goes and it wants some information. Now, obviously, if you were going to submit an actual certificate request to a genuine authority, you'd want to be putting in proper information. In my case, it's just a test lab, so I'm not too fussed. Now for here, this is where the certificate needs to line up with the fully qualified domain name that would be used when somebody connects, because the expectation is the certificate works against the FQDN, not necessarily an IP address. Now I'll have to go off and set the actual DNS server to be able to resolve this FQDN, but for now I'm just going to put in the actual name. So this is called XOA.CE, and the fully qualified domain name for me is XOA-c.templab.lan, because my domain's templab.lan in this test environment. And then we'll call email address somewhere.com. Oh, I can't use an arrow. Right. So it creates those two files. So there are certificates and key. So I'm going to head back to that folder, because we now need to actually edit that file to get it to use those. So out of the box, you could still run it, but it would just be running on port 80. But I want to change it over to it. At least it's encrypted. Now, when it comes to the certificate, not the certificate, when it comes to the actual port that's used by the server, you'd be better off using some random number. You'd need to know what it is, but for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to keep it at the typical 443. But it's better to at least change that to something else. Doesn't make it so obvious, you see. Now, in this particular case, if somebody was on your network, they could just port scan it anyway. To be fair, pretty easy to do, and then it would respond on that port. This is more for if somebody was out, getting access to a public device and they're just casually looking for web service, for example. If you've got like a virus on a network that's always looking for web service to try to infect, as long as you use something different to port 443, and the system or virus, whatever it is, isn't clever enough to think outside the box and only targets 443, well, they're not going to hit your server. Down here, these lines are commented out, and for good reason, because the server was set up to only use port 80, in which case certificates aren't relevant, but we need to actually tell the actual system about these two. So it'll be /etc /xo /xo.crt /etc /ssl /xo/xo. So yeah, xo.crt. I'm going to be a bit careful because I've tried this before. Normally the installation goes perfectly fine. When I tried it on this system, something weird went wrong. I found out I'd made a typing error. When I was actually creating the key, I think I created the key as xo.cert, and it just didn't go to plan. But what I found is if I run the installation or an update afterwards, it seemed to fix it. So we'll save that. And then what we've got to do is actually run the installation script itself. So it's going to basically reference back to this config file to get its information, and then it's going to create the actual services for us. pull down all the necessary dependencies. It does the whole thing through this one script file, which is extremely useful. So that's install.sh. Now it does take a while. I mean, you can actually run that command, the script command that you've got there, and put in -- install, I think it was referencing as an option. So you could do that and then just pick the option that way. Or you can just run it, the actual script itself, and it brings up and it tells you some information about what's going on. And then it gives you the option, do you want to install it? Do you want to update it? Do you want to roll back? The only thing to bear in mind is if you decide to roll back, you do actually need an installed version rolled back to in the first place. So it's quite handy, I suppose, because you can run updates, and if the update goes wrong, you can roll back to a previously working version. So I do quite like that. Although, to be fair, in this case, this is a virtual machine, so I would always be taking a snapshot of the actual virtual machine and rolling back. And even in this free version, I've got the luxury of being able to take snapshots. So we're going to go for installation. So off it goes. It does some checks to begin with, but it's got to pull down a series of dependencies. Now, I'll be interested to see how it goes this time, because the first time I ran this on this particular machine, like I say, normally it just goes all swimmingly well. Last time I ran it, it seemed to run into some interesting problems, so I had to install it twice to get it to actually work. So we'll see how it goes. I mean, I'll actually pause the video because it does take a bit of a while. It's got to pull all of these dependencies down first before it even starts building the system. So that's going to take a bit of a while. So rather than just keep you waiting, I'm just going to pause the video and then I'll bring you back. Well, we finally got Xen Orchestra installed. I suspect I'm having problems just because this is a test lab and it's sitting behind multiple levels of network address translation. I've got network address translation going out to the internet, network address translation taking place behind that, and I've even got a lab firewall that's doing its own network address translation. I mean, it's terrible in its design, but it's a case of I've got it set up really that was just to save me the hassle of further upstream of having to add in new static routes, for example, every time a new subnet spins up. It's a case of I wanted to try and make things simple, but I suspect that's what's the cause of my problems, because the first attempt I did to actually install this on this system, it took me 2 attempts to get it to work. Now, when I say 2 attempts, I mean running this installation script. I'd run that. It would get so far, then it would just say, nope, I'm giving up. It just didn't work. I would run it again, and then the second time round, it did actually work. Now, in this case, on my second attempt to get Xen Orchestra installed from scratch, it actually took 3 attempts. The only thing that's kind of like jogging my memory is the fact that sometimes these computers, they have problems with like DNS resolution, because I've gone into like a public web page, for example, on this computer that I've got here, the management computer, and it just couldn't resolve the actual FQDN. Then all of a sudden it just springs into life, and the browser connects. Likewise, when I was on this actual Debian machine here, I tried to resolve Microsoft's FQDN to try and find out if I was getting access to the internet before I tried to install it. Now, on one occasion it worked straight away, on another occasion it didn't. Now, I don't have that problem further upstream on the computers that sit behind the next layer of firewalls. It only seems to be these sort of computers, which is why I suspect the network address translation might be what's getting in the way. Difficult to tell. I'll have to do some experiments, but the reality is, I mean, I've got 2 Intel NUCs out there that are sitting upstream from this system, and they've been perfectly fine. I've just had to run that script once and it worked like a charm, no problems. It's only when I've tried to do it on this test lab that I've had an issue with it. And like I say, as long as I've just run it a few times, it's just worked eventually. But the good news is it's now actually installed and it's even ready to run. Because if I just go over to the tab here, I mean, I've updated my DNS server so I can actually resolve the FQDN for it. I do still get a warning, simply because this particular certificate's not trusted. If we go into and ask for its details, you can see it's my organization, lab, and so on. It's like, this is not a legit certificate. It's like, no, I'm not trusting this. So I'm going to realistically need sort of like an actual certificate authority server setting up at some point to deal with all this, because you shouldn't be really running with these, private certificates anyway. There's no reason to do it. You can set up your own certificate authority to do that. But anyway, what we can do now is log into this. So pretty straightforward. We log in as admin at admin.net. Default password is admin. Obviously, you'd want to change this, create a new account, and so on. But the gist behind this particular video really is just to explain how to get your own free copy of Xen Orchestra, not necessarily how to take full advantage of it. So once we've actually got this virtual machine up and running and Xen Orchestra is installed, well, it doesn't do anything basically. If you go back to the original one, so this is the one that's got limited abilities. So for example, go to this one and say, oh right, I'm going to have a look and see what this message is here. So we've gone to home, then to pools. If I can get back there again, click on the pool, go into the patches. I have actually renamed that to something a bit more sensible now. There's no point naming it after one hypervisor if I'm going to have multiple hypervisors on here. But you can see on here it's saying, yeah, there's some patches available, but you're going to need a starter edition subscription. Now this one, on the other hand, it will actually work, because first thing I need to do, it doesn't know anything. It's not picking up information from this version of Xen Orchestra. It's a completely new system. So the first thing I've got to do is actually add that server in. So I'll give it a label. So I know it's called XCP1, and its IP address is 172.16.19.4. So this particular machine is in the same subnet. So it's got the management of software. Xen Orchestra's got direct access to these hypervisors, which is what I'd want. I need to put in the account details for the root user, because that's the only user account that exists on this hypervisor. One thing I do need to do is actually click that box to say allow unauthorized certificates, because again, we're into private certificates. If I don't do that, it will not connect, or it'll connect, but it'll just fall over. So now when I click on connect, it has actually connected to the server. Not surprisingly, this one's now complaining, ooh, there's some patches that you need to apply in. So now if we go to home and then over to pools, pick up. So it's simple. It's got its name. It already knows what the pool's called. Go to patches. And now look at that. Look at all these patches that we need to apply, all 34 of them. So fortunately, I can just click on that option there to install our pool patches, and it'll update our hypervisor. But that's pretty much it. We've now got access to a fully working version, effectively. I mean, we are talking about things like XOA, which I don't need access to be honest. It's a case of, you're not going to get access to that. That's one thing I cannot touch, but I don't need access to it, not in this sort of environment. And not even in the actual live environment where I'm running some Intel NUCs with the intention to virtualize my home smart hub. I don't really need that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm quite perfectly happy to just have it all sitting on an NFS share. Basically, that's enough for me. As long as I've got some shared storage that I can run the virtual machines on, it means that I've got that redundancy option to protect against hardware failure. Instead of installing a virtual machine onto local storage, it goes onto shared storage like NFS. Once that's loaded up into memory, it's just running in memory. It's not going to make that many changes because I wouldn't be storing any data on the virtual machine. That's one thing you don't do in a server environment, is store data on the actual server itself. Data should be on another shared drive somewhere else. So maybe if you've got like a virtual machine, that would have maybe an SMB share if it's a Windows computer, or maybe you'd have an actual SCSI drive connected to that virtual machine, which is part of the storage for the NAS. So that's got redundant storage. But you wouldn't want to be storing data within the virtual machine. It means that the virtual machine itself is going to take longer to back up. It's just not worth it to do that. But anywho, I'm getting off topic. If I go back to my virtual machines, then we've now got two actual versions of Xen Orchestra, and I only need one. In which case, I'm going to turn this one off. So I'm just double checking. We're in the newer version. XOA-C, so I'm going to tell it to turn this version off. We don't need it. I could delete it, and I probably will at some point. Actually, I'm just going to double check. I don't think that one is actually set up to boot. on startup. Yeah, that one's not set to boot up on startup, so I can take that away. Sorry, rather, I don't need to be concerned about that one. This one, on the other hand, this is one this is the one I want to be using going forward. Actually, I may as well close that tab. There's no point keeping that open. Going forward, I want to make sure that this one, which is the one we are going to be using, is going to be up and running all the time. So we'll go into the options for that one. We'll go into advanced. And there's actually a few things I want to do. One, I want to select that option to say auto power on. So the idea is, at the moment, this particular virtual machine is running on xcp-ng-1. Somewhere down the line, it might end up on another hypervisor. To be honest, I don't care. The idea is, if this thing isn't up and running on an actual node, it better be, because it's too important. This is how we're actually managing things. This thing's keeping an eye on all those virtual machines. The idea is, if a hypervisor gets busy or something, or a virtual machine falls over, you can have high availability, and you can have a virtual machine moved off one node onto another, or spun up on a new virtual machine, and so on. That's what this beast is all about, basically. It's all about high availability, and as well as the basic management, creating and deleting virtual machines as well, and snapshots and that sort of stuff. But there's automation to consider as well in here. So for that reason, I always want this thing up and running. This thing is my top priority virtual machine. Another thing I want to do because of that is select that option to protect it from accidental deletion. Given the hassle I actually went through to actually get this thing installed, I certainly don't want to delete it. But even still, it's the fact that you don't want to be in a situation where all of a sudden you've got no management access to your hypervisors. It's like, well, okay, what do I do now? I've got no management. Somebody accidentally deleted the virtual machine. So I definitely want that option. And for a similar reason, I want that option, which is to protect it from accidental shutdown. Again, I don't want somebody turning it off. I mean, I could go into the actual hypervisor itself. You can actually manually start a virtual machine from a hypervisor, but why would you want to? This thing's supposed to be running all of the time. And on my Intel NUCs that I'm running, for example, they're running 24/7. The expectation is my smart home hub, which does run 24/7, I'm going to get a virtual version of one, and I'm going to have that running 24/7, in which case I want to make sure this thing's looking after it 24/7 as well. So yeah, those options are definitely ones to be selecting. If we go back to general, one thing I do want to do is I want to reconfigure this thing, because there's no point giving it this much memory anymore. And it doesn't need that many CPUs anymore. I mean, to be fair, it didn't actually take that long to even build, quite frankly. But I've now dropped this virtual machine down to the basics, basically. That's the minimums that we need. So I can just leave that setting as that. But yeah, we've got access to other features as well. I mean, go to visualizations. Before we didn't have that. If we go over to statistics, for example, I can get statistics about specific virtual machines. So there's an option there to add all virtual machines. At the moment, there's only one, but if I click on select, pick a metric, say, give me the heat map for this one's memory utilization. And it gives you details about the days. I mean, to be honest, this is just a new one anyway, so there's nothing much to glean from that one. I can do the same for weekly charts. We select those machines, say what about CPU utilization, for example, and it gives me a bit of detail about the actual CPU utilization on this machine. It's only down to 2 CPUs now, to be fair, but it's a case of, yeah, you can keep tabs on all sorts of metrics. I definitely like that. I'm starting to come around to this xcp-ng because it's an enterprise actual hypervisor. It is used by enterprises just like ESXi, and the way it's packaged, it's in a similar way. The idea is that the hypervisor is pretty much free. The money that they make is within the management software. You've got to pay for vCenter, basically. You get all those wonderful features like distributed switches and so on, migrations, and the full automation suite. You need vCenter effectively. And it's the same with xcp-ng. If you want a fully working version of Xen Orchestra, an enterprise, I'd be very surprised if they weren't purchasing a subscription, because for them technical support is far more important. I know there are some companies I've dealt with in the past that they don't necessarily do that because they've got usually highly skilled IT people who can usually, work things out on their own, or they can get by with information that can get out of forums, for example. So there's people who run the what used to be the free version of Red Hat, CentOS, as opposed to actually paying for the full-blown version of Red Hat. And it'll be similar with this sort of stuff. There'll be people out there who are running this with Xen Orchestra for free because you can actually compile it from source, like the dev we've got here. He's saying, if you go through his notes, he explains that they actually tell you how to do it yourself if you want to. He's just made our lives extremely easy by giving us a script file. Yes, I've had a few hiccups in my particular case, but normally I don't. So yeah, I do like this, I must admit, because I've also got a Proxmox server that I'm running for other purposes. The thing that I'm finding with that, I do like it because it runs based on Debian. But there's some things I've got to do in there from a command line, and I like this. I am from a GUI background, I should say. A lot of the stuff I do with like Cisco equipment tends to be done in the CLI, but when it comes to just one-off sort of things like, just build a virtual machine every now and again, there's not a great deal to go into the scripting. So I'm quite happy to just do it in a much simpler way. It's much easier if you're just getting started on something to be able to do everything through the GUI. Whereas if you're into operating systems like Linux typically, and you've got to start doing it through the CLI, it takes quite a bit of time to get your head around how to do it. This is, I definitely do like this, I must admit. I'm really enjoying this. So the only thing left to do really, I suppose, is, I've got to basically get these hypervisors installed because both of them are in their own separate pools, and at the moment there's only one in. I'm going to have to get them patched. And then I'm going to have to start looking into all the other wonderful features that you can get for high availability, for example. A lot of things you can do with hypervisors, different ways to do it in xcp-ng versus doing it in VMware. That's all really in other videos because there's just so many things you can do. Not enough to cover in even just a few videos. So, expect those to be in the pipeline at some point. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, because that encourages YouTube's algorithm to suggest it to other people who might find it useful as well. If you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yeah, do subscribe. Just remember to click the little bell icon though, that way you'll get notifications when I send new content out. If you've got any comments, any suggestions, if you want to leave any feedback at all, please post that in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, I've left links to both Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But above all, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.